The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. The explosion and subsequent radiation release contaminated the surrounding area, forcing thousands of people to evacuate their homes. For years, the exclusion zone around the nuclear plant has been abandoned, left to decay and be taken over by nature. But what if something else had taken hold of the area as well? Something dark and malevolent, spawned by the radiation and the horrors of that day. The 5 members of the expedition gathered at the edge of the exclusion zone. They were a motley crew, each with their own reasons for being there. There was Dr. Maria Lopez, a biologist who was fascinated by the way nature had reclaimed the area. There was Marko Petrovic, a thrill-seeker and self-proclaimed adventurer. There was Jack and Sarah, a couple who had come to document the area for a TV show. And finally, there was Yuri, their guide and the only one who had ever been inside the zone before. Yuri was a grizzled old man, his face lined with wrinkles and his hair gray and wispy. He had been a liquidator back in 1986, one of the brave souls who had risked their lives to contain the disaster. He had seen things that no one should ever have to see, and he carried the memories with him like a heavy burden. But Yuri was also the only one who knew how to navigate the exclusion zone. He led the group through the checkpoints and past the warning signs, into a landscape that was both eerily beautiful and terrifying. They walked for hours, through fields of rusted machinery and overgrown forests. They saw abandoned villages, their houses empty and crumbling. They saw the remains of the reactor, a hulking mass of metal and concrete that seemed to radiate a sense of dread. As they walked, they began to notice strange things. Animals that had mutated beyond recognition, with extra limbs or strange growths on their bodies. Plants that glowed with an eerie blue light. And in the distance, they heard strange noises, like the whispers of ghosts. But they pressed on, their curiosity driving them forward. It was on the 3rd day of their journey that they first encountered the creatures. They had set up camp in a clearing, and Yuri had warned them to be careful. The area was known to be inhabited by wild animals, and they had heard stories of wolves and bears that had grown larger and more aggressive because of the radiation. But they were not prepared for what came for them in the middle of the night. It started with a low growling noise, like a pack of dogs in the distance. But as it grew closer, they realized that it was not dogs at all. It was something much larger, much more terrifying. Marko was the first to see it. He let out a scream that woke the others, pointing towards the tree line where a pair of glowing red eyes appeared. The creature was massive, standing on 2 legs like a human but with a body that was covered in fur and muscle. Its face was twisted into a snarling mask, and its teeth were like knives. The group scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had brought guns with them, but they were not prepared for this. The creature charged towards them, its massive frame shaking the ground with each step. Dr. Lopez was the first to react, pulling out a tranquilizer gun and firing at the creature. But the dart bounced harmlessly off its thick fur, and the creature continued its charge. Jack and Sarah tried to run, but the creature caught up to them quickly, slashing at their backs with its razor-sharp claws. Yuri pulled out a shotgun and fired, but the creature seemed unfazed. It was as if the radiation had given it an immunity to traditional weapons. As the creature closed in on the group, they could feel its hot breath on their faces. They were doomed. They knew it. But then, something strange happened. The creature suddenly stopped in its tracks, as if it had hit an invisible wall. It let out a howl of frustration and turned to run back into the forest. The group was confused but relieved. They had survived their first encounter with the Chernobyl creatures, but they knew that they were not out of danger yet. As they continued their journey, they encountered more and more mutated animals. There were birds with wingspans that were wider than they were tall. There were insects the size of small dogs, with sharp pincers and venomous stingers. But the most horrifying mutations were the ones that affected humans. They came across a village that had been abandoned since the disaster, but there were signs of recent activity. They found footprints in the dust and a fire that had been recently extinguished. And then they saw a group of humanoid figures stumbling towards them. These were not ordinary humans. Their skin was gray and sagging, and their eyes were vacant and soulless. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if they were not fully in control of their bodies. Dr. Lopez recognized the signs of radiation sickness. These were people who had been exposed to high levels of radiation and had mutated beyond recognition. The group was horrified, but they knew that they had to keep moving. They couldn't risk getting too close to the mutants, who seemed to have lost all sense of reason. They had been walking for days, and they were exhausted. But they knew that they could not stop. They had to keep going to find out what was causing these mutations and put a stop to it. And then they found it. It was a massive structure, looming up out of the ground like a hive. It was made of a strange, metallic material, and it pulsed with a sickly green glow. Yuri recognized it immediately. It was the heart of the Chernobyl creatures, the source of their power. The group approached cautiously, their guns at the ready. They could hear strange noises coming from within the structure, like the buzzing of 1,000 insects. As they entered, they found themselves in a maze of tunnels and chambers, all leading deeper into the heart of the hive. They encountered more mutants along the way, but they were able to fend them off with their weapons. Finally, they reached the center of the hive. It was a massive chamber, filled with strange equipment and pulsating pods. And in the center, there was something that made their blood run cold. It was a massive creature, unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was covered in scales and tendrils, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. This was the queen of the Chernobyl creatures, the source of their mutations. The group knew what they had to do. They had to destroy the queen, to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. They opened fire, unleashing a barrage of bullets and explosives at the queen. It screeched and thrashed, its tendrils lashing out at the group. But they were determined. They kept firing, even as the creature grew weaker and weaker. And then, there was a sudden explosion. The queen erupted in a shower of sparks and flames, and the hive began to collapse around them. The group ran for their lives, dodging falling debris and mutant creatures. They could hear the roar of the collapsing hive behind them, and they knew they had only moments to escape. They burst out of the hive just as the entire structure collapsed in on itself. The ground shook beneath their feet, and they were thrown to the ground. When they looked up, they saw that the sky was darkening. The clouds were thick and black, and there was an eerie silence in the air. They knew what it meant. The radiation levels were increasing, and they had to get out of there fast. They ran for their helicopter, which was waiting for them on the outskirts of the forest. As they took off, they looked back at the smoldering ruins of the Hive. They had done it. They had put an end to the Chernobyl creatures, but at what cost? They knew that the radiation levels would continue to rise, and that the effects of the disaster would be felt for years to come. As they flew away, the group could only hope that their sacrifice had been worth it, that they had saved the world from a fate worse than death. But they knew that they would never forget the horrors they had witnessed in Chernobyl. The mutated creatures, the abandoned villages, the pulsing heart of the Hive. It would haunt them for the rest of their lives.